as you talked about, because, there's a lot of pride and tradition in the fire service. Welcome to the Triple P Podcast, premier, professional, and proactive, brought to you by the Ohio Fire Chiefs Association. I'm your host, Clayton O'Brien, and I'm the fire chief for the city of Oregon. I want to welcome Representative David Thomas to the Triple P. David's a state representative for the Ohio House of Representatives. Today, we're going to talk all about the property tax reform, and he is the perfect guest to have on our show. David Thomas serves as a member of the Ohio House of Representatives, where he has built a reputation for focusing on fiscal responsibility, government accountability, and public policy that impacts the local communities. With a professional background that includes experience in finance and public service, Thomas brings a data-driven approach to the legislative decision-making. He's got one heck of a career. Before and during his time in the elected office, Thomas has been involved in the financial management and public sector work, or giving him insight into budgeting, taxation, and the operational side of government. His legislative work has included community involvement tied to finance, infrastructure, and public policy oversight. He's been a huge advocate when it comes to fiscal responsibility, budgeting at the state level. He has supported policies aimed at transparency and efficient government operations. He's contributed to the legislative discussions affecting local municipalities and public safety funding. He's always been engaged in community and stakeholders on the economic and infrastructure issues, and he's got areas of expertise all over the place. And we'll start with the public finance and budgeting. He's got state and local government operations expertise, policy development and legislative process, infrastructure, and community investment. Boy, I tell you what, Mr. Representative David Thomas, I am so happy for you to take the time. I'm so happy that you took the time to be able to be on the Triple P. You taking the time out has really meant a lot for us and a lot for me, and to all the local leaders that you're going to have an impact on through the show. So thank you for taking a little bit of time, and let's get right into it.
So I definitely appreciate the more about this, just educating and getting the word out, and especially local governments knowing that we're not trying to abolish. We're just trying to reform, because a lot of local governments think it's us that's pushing just to get rid of them.
Yeah.
Not the case.
Yeah, and I think that's a good starting point. Really, I think that it's a very it's one of those topics that when you hear about abolishing the property tax, a lot of people I think there's two sides of it. A lot of people get really, really excited about it, and then a lot of people get really, really scared about it. And I think they get really, really scared about it because, there's no plan, essentially. If there was the possibility of the abolishment, there's no plan to replace all this. And any common sense America knows that the streets have to be fixed and the police and fire departments have to be funded to show up at your house in the event of that nature. Yep. So I think you doing this and being, the individual that's going to be out there educating, or at least helping us educate everybody, is greatly appreciated. So,
I've been doing about 4 town halls a week.
Have you really?
I'm just traveling the state. Yeah. Talking to folks, explaining.
Wow. Well, let's start with what's broken. What's broken with the Ohio property, tax, in Ohio. You hear about this, and obviously it's been a grassroots effort, for individuals to abolish it. What would be your take on, what's broken with the property tax as it sits today?
Yeah, a lot is, and that's where we've boiled up with all this frustration and all the anger. Property taxes are original form of taxation, ironically, here in the state. And when you have 223 years worth of just adding on and on and on to a system, it gets really out of whack. I was a county auditor for 6 years up in Ashtabula prior to becoming a state rep last year, and just saw it literally firsthand. Really, it came to a crisis point, broke over the past 6 years. Property values spiked. We had the COVID increases, lots of additional values, cash, and really the system was not supposed to move with the real estate market in terms of values. It did. What that meant was people had huge unvoted increases in their tax bill, and that frustration has just boiled over. It shouldn't have happened. It wasn't right. Essentially our system did not react how it should have. So that's at a base level in terms of what's currently broken, and what the legislature has done to try to address that fits with essentially property value spiking. Property tax bills shouldn't have, but they did. And that's, I think, one of the core pieces of what went wrong over, especially the last 6 years.
And so this really just started with kind of right there. Somebody got upset about that, right? And then just started the grassroots effort, say, hey, we gotta, at least force the hand of the General Assembly to do something to make some changes. But to the extreme of abolishment compared to maybe making some reform, I think is two different things, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. So that's an important piece. Three things I think. First is the state of Ohio, the legislature actually received $0 in property taxes. All property taxes stay at the local level. So because it's not a state revenue, we've actually been cutting and decreasing state income tax, state sales tax every 2 years. But property tax we've kind of left alone because it's not actually our revenue. And it's come to that boiling point where enough has been growing. Even before COVID, there were issues, but not to the level. And so then that boiled over to the frustration with the citizens. And those citizens asked for changes. They asked for strong reforms. They weren't getting it. And I know the committee personally. So these are grassroots, purely voluntary. They're just upset. They're angry citizens. The legislature is not looking to abolish, but citizen group is. They're all across the state, and they've essentially said legislature wasn't listening. They didn't act. Local governments who could have essentially decreased tax rates or not accepted all these increases, they didn't act. We're going to act for them. And they're pushing the abolish side. The reforms, now we'll talk about some of the reforms that we've done, wouldn't have been possible without the strong anger and frustration from the citizens, though. So I actually usually thank them. I don't support the effort, but I thank them for what they've done because they've shown just how frustrated people are with what's happening, and they're willing to essentially blow the system up without a plan just because of what's happened.
But you made a really good point because I think that there's a lot of people that don't understand that the legislator of the state of Ohio has no gain essentially with eliminating property tax. It is at the local level that all the property taxes that we pay currently today affect our local communities that we live in directly.
Yeah,
And
$24 billion worth.
wow, $24 billion worth. So with that $24 billion stretched across the entire state of Ohio, that just, goes away, but that's all just effectively affecting the local governments, meaning that whatever community you live in, if you're paying property tax but have no way of being able to replace it, because some communities might look at it and say, well, we have a replacement of being able to have an income tax or a sales tax or those sorts of things to replace that sort of tax. But like in small villages, in areas in small townships, they don't maybe even have a gas station or a store or the ability to replace any sort of revenue to be able to take care of their township roads or, plow the streets.
Right. Yeah, we've given local governments flexibility with how to actually do revenue. So sales tax, income tax, property tax are kind of spread around at the local level. Counties have the sales tax option. They can raise property tax, they can raise sales tax. Cities and villages have the income tax. They can raise income tax, they can raise property tax to fund their services. Schools actually, a third of our schools have an income tax at the local level. So schools can have an income tax and or property tax. Townships really are the only form of government that have no other revenue source that they can have except for property tax. And that's because townships are essentially supposed to be that very basic, small level. Where you get a little bit trickier are some of the other services. Like, if you have a fire district, for example, if you have an EMS district, those are purely based off of the property tax side. We do see some counties, especially Southeast Ohio, where it's a county-wide system and it's run by the county. And so that can be funded then through the sales tax, for example. And these are some of the things we're encouraging local governments to try to do. Is our go-to inclination in Ohio is always, let's just have a levy. We'll raise the property tax to fund this service. We can't keep thinking that way because it's just too high. We've been stacking it far too much. So using your other revenue sources, and that's why we have a record number of income tax levies on the ballot this year for schools. They're done looking at the property tax. They're looking at income tax. But should abolish happen, for example, there would be a lot. There's a lot there because our foundational system was built off of the property tax side. And how would we do some of these services? I tell folks, people will still want their police. They'll still want their fire. They'll still want their roads. They just, by voting to abolish, they don't want it paid up for off of their home. They want it somewhere else. But I always caution folks, one, that's a massive change in just how we're structured in 6 weeks, roughly. Get on the ballot. It passes November. No more property taxes January 1st. Massive change in just 6 weeks. But the second thing is most Ohioans will actually pay more. To your point, if you shift it over to individuals with income and sales, there's a good number of counties that cannot raise their sales tax enough to actually make up the difference. Or, talk about the income tax amount and how much we'd actually be paying, because the dirty secret is property tax is funded about a third or more by commercial properties. And then there's more that's also public utilities. You abolish all that, you shift it all over to the individual with income and sales. It's the individual who's actually paying a lot more. It'd be one of the largest commercial and corporate tax breaks in Ohio's history and in the nation. So there's just so much there that it is our goal then being, as a legislature, incremental, steady improvements and reforms. There's benefits just blowing the system up sometimes, but the system that's foundational to most of our services that we all love and appreciate is not really the right way to do it.
Yeah, because I've heard some scary numbers on the sales tax stuff.
Yeah.
And in the upwards of 20% or 17% in some areas, and ultimately then people just get scared, saying, well, they're no longer going to shop in our local community. They're just going to travel to the place that's going to have the lower sales tax. And for us up here in Northwest Ohio, that's just across the line, one way or the other, whether it be Indiana or Michigan. Or you maybe go county to county, because maybe one county is a lot less sales tax than the other. And I think it is a lot more, to your point, I think a lot more complex than what some individuals really truly understand of what this property tax thing is. But I think everybody does agree, though, to say, hey, there might need to be some reform, but in some incremental strategic ways of making the reform. And I think that your legislator did some of that stuff by, bill, if I remember right, it's like House Bill 920. What was that?
That was 50 years ago.
Okay.
50 years ago, Ohio was ahead of the curve. We essentially said, when you vote for a levy, that money coming into the government and that money charging you will never increase. Your value can keep going up, but that voted levy will always stay constant. So that way you're separated out completely, value increases from your property tax increases, ahead of the curve.
Okay.
What we did do, though, 50 years ago, and what we're now doing today, actually this past year, there's a portion of your tax bill that's not voted, and it's attached directly to your values as they go up. This is something called inside or unvoted millage tax rate that's on every local government. And there's also a minimum guarantee tax rate to the schools as well, something called the 20 mil floor. Those two aspects are why on your tax bill, when your value spiked over the last 6 years, all those voted levies you approved, those levies actually, their tax rate decreased, didn't charge you anymore, government didn't receive any more, but that portion of your bill that's attached directly to your value, that skyrocketed. So I was just at a township last night. They got a 35% increase in their revenue because their property owners had a 35% increase in their values. That should never have happened.
Okay.
And over the last 50 years, the legislature never essentially addressed that until the crisis that we have today. So with the 5 bills that we passed last year, reform bills, and the governor signed, we've now capped that unvoted portion to inflation. So your value could go up by 35%, but your local township, your county, your school will only get an inflationary increase. Maybe it's 8%, for example, whatever inflation was over the last 3 years. That's a huge difference in savings and prevention of those spikes moving forward. And it's the way that we're kind of separating out when your value increases. Now, your value can increase by 35%. You don't have to be worried or scared because your tax bill is only increasing by inflation.
And I think that's what a lot of people got really upset about, and probably was the main driving force, wasn't it?
Yes, it had. I like to joke, had we passed these 5 bills 6 years ago, pre-COVID, I would still be auditor in Ashtabula. I would have never run because we wouldn't have had the crisis and we wouldn't have had the frustration, because bills, instead of them going up by, you add 2 revaluation cycles over half, if not almost 75%, they would have only gone up maybe a fifth, if that.
Yeah.
Just inflation over the last. So Huge differences that now we've corrected moving forward. And we're kind of now once again ahead of the curve. No other state this past year, despite everyone else having huge tax problems, Texas, Florida, others, no others did actual reforms. Ohio was the only state that really dove in, made changes, which were long needed.
Now, and I think the other change, if I remember right, was the change when it came to like a replacement or a renewal levy. So if you're like before, you could put on a replacement and not have to, and that would just go up to the new the valuation. Where today, if I understand it right, if you want new money, you need to go for a new levy. It's no longer this replacement. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, our five bills kind of fall into three different buckets. One is what I just mentioned, stopping spikes, no longer spikes in your property tax bill, capped at inflation. Second bucket are actual direct cuts this year for most Ohioans. You'll see a credit on your second half bill. You'll see increases in your owner occupancy credit. You may actually see some doubling of your homestead or owner occupancy credit if your county commissioners approve the piggyback. And then the third bucket is a lot more essentially voter control. And it's changing a lot of the misleading or just confusing ballot language. For example, things like replacement levies, emergency levies, substitute levies, all of those just either confused voters or drove them to vote yes because they thought they had to. So now moving forward, very, very clear. Either you're voting to increase your tax bill with an additional levy, or you're voting to keep your tax bill the same with the renewal.
Wow.
So
Okay.
there's
Yep.
no longer the replacements, the confusion aspects. It's going to be very, very straightforward to the voter. And I tell every firefighter or police officer I meet, like the voters want you. There's other services necessarily that there's questions, but the voters want you. And so, they will more than often than not support you when you ask them. What they don't want, though, is to be forced to pay for you without any control or say over how much you're actually getting. So I personally do envision more levies moving forward, more asks, but that goes back to the whole philosophy that government shouldn't be taking money from your home. They should be asking you for it,
Yeah.
which is what the levy and the democratic process is all about.
Yeah, I do agree with that. And so if you did have a levy in place, let's say I had a 4 mil levy that's already in place, and we wanted to do not a replacement, but we needed to do an additional. Does that 4 mil is that 4 mil levy essentially uh could that be at odds if I'm trying to go for an additional two, or does that just stay in place if that additional doesn't pass, or how does that all work?
Yeah, it depends on timing of
Okay.
things. I would encourage, the entity, for example, to renew that 4 mil levy. That's probably the base foundational, revenue that's coming in to pay for the service. If they need more money, then not that year, but maybe the year after, the following year, asking for that additional amount and probably going through cycles.
Okay.
A lot of schools will do this depending on their needs, but kind of cycling through and then telling the voters, hey, this levy is our core services. Then in 2 years, this levy, you just passed it 4 years ago. Now where it's up for renewal, it's for more equipment that we just keep recycling. So kind of having that plan in place, separating out some of the uses, um, and not relying on the unvoted increased revenue that would come in every 3 years in the revaluation.
Okay. Yeah, because and then, I just really want to make the point that all the property taxes that individuals are paying today are all property taxes that those individuals within your community passed and have in place. So, like what the property tax that
Um,
we paid almost, okay.
That unvoted portion,
Yeah.
that hasn't been approved.
Oh, true,
But you're right.
because that 20 mil floor and that unvoted, it was on the
Yes.
valuation, which is why we're
Yep.
here today, most
Yes.
likely.
It
But
varies.
yeah.
Some communities, it might be 95% of the bill was all voted.
Okay.
Other communities, it may be only actually half of the bill was voted. It really will vary, but especially for the folks that we're talking to, for most fire, either districts or most fire services, that is not part of the unvoted portion, obviously not schools. And if you're in a township or a city, typically you'll have levies that pay for you versus the unvoted portion, which pays for general services.
Okay.
Um, but if my original version of House Bill 335 would have done that, would have said no more unvoted portion. You will only have voted portion moving forward. That was too much too fast. So we've kept the unvoted portion, but now just capping to inflation.
Capped it to, which is, I think, is still a good compromise, essentially, because, I think that was the frustration for a lot. And and I myself can simply understand that, a great deal. Now we talk about, that we have this feeling that everybody would, support their police department and their fire department if they're, if they're being funded by a property tax. But like in my case, I'm the fire chief for the city of Oregon, which is a city. So then we collect an income tax. But property tax for us, we don't collect as much. It's mainly the schools that have the property tax in the city, but we do have an effect in the city of an inside millage. So it could vary. And the couple cities that I had worked for had an inside millage, and that inside millage would usually, cities vary on what they use it for, but in both cases, I've been accustomed to that would kind of be like the police and fire pension fund that would fund on the inside millage piece. Well, now with all this conversation about the abolishment of property tax, I've heard different fire chiefs that are city chiefs say, well, hey, you know what, that doesn't really affect me because we're an income based or income tax is how we're funded. And the only issue that I have with that is that I think that because of the scare on this abolishment of the property tax, that we're going to start seeing the school systems begin to look or turn towards an income tax over a property tax. And then that would be a direct competition for local city services with your local schools on an income tax, because now they're essentially going to be running a 0.25% or a 0.75% income tax. And that would be a direct competition, I think, to the local cities.
Sure. So it will vary. Most of the income tax school districts that we have right now, like I said, 1/3, most of them are your rural parts of the state that are heavy land rich and income poor. They typically have more seniors, more farmers, and so they balance it out. I always tell folks the right type of tax policy is kind of like a three-legged stool: income, sales, property, all about balanced. When you're too heavy on the property, you're overburdening those who are most harmed by the property tax. And then you're rewarding essentially those most harmed by income and sales because you're not having as high on them. So maybe in some cities, for example, it is relatively balanced. Your income tax is right about equal with your property tax side, and everything is right about there. That's not the case for most. Most it still is way too heavy on the property side, and there needs to be some type of rebalance there. But it's a little bit difficult. Take a step back. Ohio has over 4,000 taxing jurisdictions. We are the most in the nation per capita, higher than California, higher than New York. That is a very complicating aspect of this whole conversation because we love our local control. We love all of our local layers, all of our local levels, but that makes it more difficult to try to have uniform tax policy, uniform reforms and changes. And frankly, it makes it difficult to make things more cost effective.
What makes up those 4,000? What makes up those 4,000? Are you saying 4,000 taxing jurisdictions? We're talking about like a senior center or a police department or a fire department, schools, is that what's considered a taxing jurisdiction?
Yeah, 1,300 townships,
Okay.
900 municipalities, 614 schools. We have, I'm trying to remember how many special districts like fire, EMS districts, water and soil districts that have a tax, senior types of districts that have taxes. So some public community colleges actually are a taxing jurisdiction, for example. All of those level on to a little over 4,000 that actually have access to the property tax bill across the state.
Wow.
And that's much more than most, but that's our history. Our history is the Connecticut Western Reserve is that layer. The states that have much lower property tax burden are more of your western states or your southern states that are much more county based. There's not as many actual entities. It's all kind of more regionalized. There's pros and cons to that aspect too, but it makes it a lot easier to do uniform tax policy and tax reform when you have less layers.
Sure. Yeah. Now, do you think because there's going to be there's the potential for additional levies or more levies, do you think that we are already at a place where where voters have levy fatigue, or what would you say down the road if there is going to be more levies?
So Great question.
Yeah.
And I anticipate you asking this. Levy fatigue, really, what does that actually mean? That means it's tax fatigue. Previously, when we had levy fatigue, what we really had was just the frustration over the government taking more and more without our say. Now, moving forward, we're asking much more through the levies. And if our voters start to have fatigue over how many levies are there, that's the sign that they're being taxed too high. And I think that means that it's worked and it has much more of that voter and that taxpayer control. Where that system actually kind of falls, we'll have to see. But there will come a point, and I think it's here in many areas where simply put, our residents are paying too much. The taxes are just too high, and they're done. Um, they have to then decide where will they prioritize? What will they actually spend their money on? Tax policy in Columbus has essentially been we've been decreasing the income tax. We decreased it again to the 1.5 billion this past year in the budget. We give back roughly a billion and growing in our sales tax every year. So the idea has been send less to Columbus. We want less. You keep more of it at the local level, and then you decide where does your money actually go and how do you want to spend it.
So is there any safeguards in place for like your police and fire departments or your emergency services? Has there been any talk about that? If there was this, it's my understanding that there's not enough signatures, at least at this point. They held a press conference and, described that. But, has there been any talk about that? Would there be any safeguards, or it would just be completely abolished and there's no property tax?
It's signed on the dotted line in the Constitution. No
Okay.
property taxation after January 1st. But the services, so that would be a lot of the question about how we actually do the services. I could envision, and I've had people take me out of context with saying, well, Rep. Thomas just wants to abolish townships. No, but I would envision essentially townships would no longer exist. Some of your larger townships may become cities, but for the most part, they would just morph into the county.
Yeah.
All the services, if you have fire departments that are township based, for example, or even more district type fire departments, I would envision us moving to more of a southern or western state model where everything's based off of the county and the county has the sales tax then to be able to actually fund all those different services. Not going away, but it's shifting really how we deliver it and how we pay for it. But that needs to take longer than 6 weeks to actually formalize.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
that's where a lot of the it's just gray area because we don't know. And I'm only speaking for myself. I can't speak for the legislature about how that would probably work. Um, but there would be no protections. There would be no, safeguards. We would still have the law in the books that you have to provide, fire service that the county has to provide, the sheriff, for example, those types of things. But it would be essentially the biggest kind of shakeup in Ohio structure in our history. And so whatever we think of as just traditional, normal service operation will have to be changed.
Yeah, and you're right. The southern, I have a brother-in-law that works down in Florida, and a lot of those, that's how a lot of their fire
Mhm.
departments and a lot of different agencies are set up as a county-wide. And but even with that, again, that goes back to that the county per county. You have a rural county compared to a more metro county, or at least with a metro city, has a lot more opportunity for sales tax that can drive that cost lower. And those people then the rural counties are going to, travel to where that cheaper sales tax is, if that's the case.
Yeah, that's a very, Vinton County is the go-to example. They just don't have the sales tax base to be able to make up for it. Now, granted, folks will not have their property tax burden, but that shifting and that will open questions in terms of county operations too, and what those different pieces. But I do not envision us at the state level increasing taxes and the response then being sending a whole lot more to Columbus and us taking from some of the areas and giving to other areas. Um, Nor do I think people want that because that's a large centralization of government at the state level as well.
Now, so let's talk about who really benefits from this and who really loses from this. and maybe touch on that a little bit of what your thoughts are on who wins and who loses. And then maybe if you could touch a little bit on the signatures and just let the audience know, like, where are they at with that amount? And if we think that they're going to get to the finish line, and then if they don't get to that finish line this year, do they get to it next year? And maybe touch base on that.
Yeah. So who benefits and who loses from our reform efforts in the legislature? Really, everyone benefits in the sense that we've prevented future issues, we've tamped down costs, we've decreased some bills. That helps then commercial, residential, farm, agriculture properties, and government still receive more, but much more tamped down. So that kind of benefits. I view that as the win-win. You abolish. Who benefits the most from abolishing? It is your large landowners. It's your farmers, possibly. It's your commercial properties. It's your landlords. It's certainly your corporations. I joke with folks, data centers are the hot topic right now. Who would be happiest? Data
Yeah.
centers.
Yeah.
So there's that thing to consider. Who would lose then? Biggest over, abolishing. Obviously, like I said, the structuring. We purely could not do a dollar for dollar replacement of all that money. So we would then have to decrease services, decrease the cost, which I do argue we are spending far too much at the local level for all of our services anyway. But the question is how much. Your seniors would benefit the most because they're not having the income coming in necessarily, but they're paying on the property side. You shift that though, and now you're hurting, while you're benefiting your seniors, you're hurting then your working families, especially your younger families, and potentially your farmers actually as well, depending on what their income looks like and what those pieces are with their, especially their purchasing. A much higher sales tax, we'd have to remove a lot of those carve outs, a lot of those credits or exemptions for sales tax. So you would help some, but you would hurt many others as well. I think the average Ohioan would actually pay much more than what they're currently paying should property taxes go away. They announced they have 305,000 signatures. You need roughly 412,000 by July 1st to be on that November ballot. Should they not turn them in this year, they can turn them in next year. Ohio is something called an evergreen or a wet signature state, meaning that signature is good as long as you are a valid registered voter at the location that you signed. Obviously, the longer you have the petitions out, people move, people die, you're going to lose signatures, but you're still collecting more. So they can wait. They can turn them in next July 1st for November of 2027. The general rule of thumb and their goal is they want to turn in about 600 or so thousand because you're going to have a lot of signatures that aren't valid. They didn't say whether the 305 were valid signatures or were just total signatures coming in as well. But it is possible they try. Should they put it on the ballot and try this November, turn it in by July 1st? If they don't have enough, if enough are marked invalid, those would all actually then be counted out and they have to start over from zero.
Oh, okay.
Our goal with all of our reform efforts, which saves Ohioans $3.8 billion just in 3 years, this year, next year, the following year. Our goal with those efforts were to lower the temperature. We won't be able to convince anyone not to sign or not to vote, but we're giving them more time to think. They're not as angry. They know that the legislatures act, things will be better. And then you can process, is this something that will benefit me? Or is this something that will actually hurt me? And that's kind of all we're asking voters and Ohioans to do is just take a step back and think about this before just automatically thinking, oh yeah, it's a great thing, I'll sign.
Sure.
But they're still in limbo. I tell everyone the best defense is a good offense. We have to show Ohio taxpayers that we're changing, that what happened was wrong, that things will be better. So making changes now, decreasing tax rates, sharing services, possibly consolidating some services to lower costs, all the efforts that we've done at the legislative level, and actually returning some of that money back to the taxpayers, I think shows them we're serious. We know that what happened can't continue and we're going to make changes.
Yeah, because if it's going to cost more money the other way with the sales tax, and honestly, it would take the legislator to make those changes too, wouldn't it? For them to increase the sales tax, because
we capped counties at 2% above the current sales tax. So we would essentially lift off caps, I would think,
yeah,
for counties. Cities can have however high of income tax you'd like, schools as well. But counties are actually capped right now. I would envision us just removing the cap and then them increasing.
Wow. Yeah, that could get really, really crazy. Um,
But you no longer have it on your home.
yeah.
And that's for many folks, that aspect of it being on your home is enough that they're willing to pay more or pay in a different way. And I like to joke with folks, yes, if you don't pay your property tax, Ohioans really, if you're actually living in your home, very, very infrequently is foreclosure happening, but it does happen. But what happens if you don't pay your income tax or you don't pay your sales tax? Yes,
Mhm.
you're not losing your home, but they're taking you to jail.
Yep.
So the government gets its money because the government is the government. And any way you look at it, taxes are just inherently not the best.
Hey, Josh, let's take a quick break. Let's take a break from the conversation. I want to get down to a little bit of business to share with our audience. If you're a company serving the fire service, this is where you want to be. The Triple P podcast, that's premier, professional, and proactive, is reaching the fire service leaders, decision makers, and frontline firefighters across Ohio and beyond. These are the people shaping departments, purchasing equipment, and just driving the future of the fire service. Our listeners aren't just tuning in, they're taking action. We offer affordable sponsorship opportunities, including mid-roll placements just like this one, designed to put your brand directly in front of the fire service community. So whether you're an apparatus, training, equipment, software, or any type of other fire service related items, this is your chance to connect with the people who matter the most. So if you're interested in partnering with us, reach out today at tripplepodcast74@gmail.com and let's get your message on the Triple P.
You'll have to pay.
Well, you've been doing a lot of educating out there too. So, how about if you put yourself in our shoes as fire chiefs, or local leaders in our areas? What, how would you go about, educating the people around us, if you will, without being, because this topic can be very controversial, and you want to understand what both sides of what it is, but you also want to educate at the same time without like coming off defensive or to as a local leader just to say, hey, I don't disagree that there needs to be some reform and that we need to just have this open discussion. But some people that are so far off to understand that of what truly is the property tax and how it is, how would we go about as local leaders to talk to our local individuals or educate them?
Yeah, two aspects with that. The first one is I've seen a lot more just community forums or community open houses, for example, to come into the fire station or police station, kind of talk with members. I've seen a lot more kind of like coffee with cops and different things, just getting people out. That's just general good policy anyway at the local level. Um, Telling folks essentially costs. I think most people don't realize the cost of a fire truck or an ambulance, for example, how everything stacks up. Especially my generation, I think we want to see where our money is actually going. We
Mhm.
want a direct impact of what I'm actually paying, and that helps to at least demystify some of the frustration and some of the like the government just taking my money and they're spending it. I don't know how. Um, but then paired with that, when you're doing the actual outreach and you're just kind of purely educating, not trying to convince, not trying to, because people can see through that. When you're doing the education outreach, again, the best defense is the right offense. And I think that whether it's a fire department or police department or the parks or any of our local services, we have to look at what we're actually spending and how we're providing that service and operating and making changes. In my area, Ashtabula and Trumbull, I kind of joke with some of my townships. Almost every township has their own fire department. I have 42 townships in my district. Think of how many trucks that is.
Yeah, yeah, it's a
We don't
lot.
have the people anymore. We don't have the
Mhm.
volunteers or the staff. We have the money for the equipment, but we can't actually afford to run it. And it's a very uncomfortable conversation. But I do say the C word a lot in terms of consolidating those services and what that looks like. And I think more and more entities are open to that because there's just pure fiscal realities
Mhm.
that we cannot continue as we've been doing. And I think showing the voters and the taxpayers that we're willing to make those changes and not just keep going back to them on their property to pay more and more and more. That I think is part two of how that's not coming from us. That can't come from us. Because we're the big bad Columbus people, and there's a whole bunch of things with that. But they're actual local people who are providing the service, who they know and live in their community. That conversation has to happen organically. It can't be forced by us.
Yeah.
But it has to occur.
Well, and I think you're right. I think it is a very tough conversation to have, as you talked about, because, there's a lot of pride and tradition in the fire service. And that's where it really had boiled down 42 townships and 42 fire stations, because there's 42 central community. Like it's usually in the center of everybody's town. And that's where you went for the pancake breakfast and the chicken barbecue and things.
Just did one on Sunday.
Yeah. See, and that's the hard part. And I think what's not only, I think what's also forcing that conversation, or at least people to be open more to it, to your point, is sometimes it's not as hard to get the capital improvement, the capital equipment, because of grants and so on and so forth for the local volunteer departments. But what's driving maybe the local departments to even be open to the conversation is just the simple fact of the recruiting piece. There's no long, it's so hard to get individuals into the service. And so it almost forces the hand that they got to talk to the neighbor, because they're going to have to, respond together. And that's where that, kind of morphs into a little bit more of that ego kind of coming down and opening up to have a, conversation. I know it's not for everybody in every community, but I certainly think that it is for some. And then whether that's the talk of the district or whether it's the talk of, because like even in county EMS systems, there's some counties that just support EMS, but not necessarily fire services. And, but yet there's such an impact. And I think they fund the EMS service because obviously that's 80% of the runs most of the time. And 20% of the runs is still a small number for a lot of communities when you're talking about the fire response. So you need manpower to respond to the EMS calls, but you're still relying on that volunteer aspect for the fire side. And ultimately it's just not, it's just not sustainable, I think, long term. And so it's definitely got to have that conversation. What other unintended consequences would you, that we're not talking about? We see the obvious things. If we don't have property tax, we might not have our streets done, or we might not have a police department or fire department or things like that. Is there anything like we're not thinking of that's the unintended consequences?
So, two things. We will still have those services. They'll just be very different than what we currently have them. And some folks may be okay with that. I think a lot of folks will not be. But one of the things that people don't think about, and this is just the normal taxpayer doesn't have a concept of these things, are bonds. So there are several billions of dollars worth of bonds at the local level that are taken out for equipment, for fire trucks, for fire departments, for their buildings, for example, all different types of things at the local level. If the property tax goes away, all of those are actually traditionally backed by the property tax, because that's considered the most stable form of revenue coming in. If they're no longer being backed and can be paid for by those, there's defaults. And that is then a string of consequences. Now, your average homeowner doesn't really care about whatever I'm about to say, but it actually does impact them, because the more defaults you have, you can't afford to pay back. The bond market, the banks, the financial sector suddenly views Ohio as a non-stable form of investment. You see, even on personal, you see interest rates, you see borrowing becoming tremendously more difficult, and you likely will see a complete freeze of any type of local projects that many folks, I think, will probably want. That's something no one really thinks about.
Wow. Yeah.
And there's a lot of questions about the legality. In the Constitution, it actually says we can't take over local debt at the state level. The county can't take over local debt at the county level. So who actually pays for it? Just lots of lawyer fees that will be paid, and litigation happening that no one really talks about, but is actually kind of a pretty wonky impact on everyday Ohioans as well.
Yeah, because if that was to happen and that trickle down effect, and there's a freeze and there's no bonds and no projects, does that all the way make it down to the blue collar worker? Because if there's no projects happening, there's nobody putting in a water line or doing the streets or doing the asphalt or doing the concrete or doing the, whatever. And I think that impacts a lot of just your normal individuals that also live in the community, but now have no work essentially.
Yep. And roads,
Yeah.
bridges, water, sewer, all those different things. It's just another example of how ideally we do this incrementally and in
Hmm.
steps versus wholesale um, blowing up.
Is that and that's what long-term success looks like for you is so it's not to stop where we're at now. What would you say is that next incremental step then? So of where we're at now, what would be that next one?
So our five bills we passed last year essentially corrected what was back, prevented, like I said, from happening again. Our next steps are twofold. One, I have a lot of other bills that deal with a lot of the frustrations with the system folks have on like the valuation process, on appealing of property taxation, on the farm credit side, um, on abatements and exemptions and carve outs that actually increase bills for others. A lot of those different small frustrations on one aspect. And then the second piece, I think, then incrementally has to be our spending side. It's two sides of the same coin. If we do all this tax policy, but then we're not actually addressing the spending, it's going to have to come from somewhere. So that is actually a much more difficult conversation than the tax policy side, but it's even more important.
Yeah, it's got to be both sides. I see. What trying to think of if is there anything I haven't covered yet or anything that we
There's a lot here. I mean, we could go
I
by
know.
town hall. I mean, I encourage anyone that's listening. I try to do a ton on social media, educating. My YouTube channel has all my different town halls that I do. I actually put them up on for audio as well, and then also on social media. There's just a lot here, and it's important. Information right now is very scattered and it's very inaccurate.
Hmm.
Um, and so having the right information out there though, and being able to share that with others, I think is really vital right now because we have to take actions. We have to base it off of what's actually factual.
Yeah, and I hear a lot of times it's just a scare tactic, like oh, well, they're just saying it's going to be 20% or it's just going to be, 10% income tax or whatever. They're just saying that, but doesn't really mean it. Well, but yet what else? There's nowhere, you can't make up 25 billion or whatever it is, like that's a huge number. And so,
Yeah, there's different ways. That's one of the problems is we don't have an actual because this isn't our plan. This isn't our action as a legislature. We, the legislature, would never introduce this without actually having what would happen. And so, because we can't point to what exactly would happen, there's a lot of what ifs, there's a lot of potential, but we can't say exactly if this, then that,
mhm.
because we like I said, we couldn't replace dollar for dollar 24 billion. It'd
Yeah,
be impossible.
yeah, that would
And
be
so,
impossible.
what does that actually look like though? That's
Well, I've
that's
heard
funny.
different things like in different areas. When we talked about like countywide down in Florida, I've heard like, okay, so they don't have, a property tax but maybe they've carved out the school portion is, I guess, the way I understand it. But then there's maybe some things for their fees. They might do like a service payment for their, like maybe for their fire department, and that might just be how they like a utility bill you pay for, and that I bring that up because back in, the history of the fire service, that used to be how it was with EMS. You paid the $7 or somebody's not going to come, or, you had the insurance mark on your house and only the firefighters would come to those ones because they were ran by companies. Have you heard about that kind of model?
Yeah, that's an option, and that's actually still an option today. You know, my no, my parents' EMS district, they are members of their district, which means that they don't get charged if they do a call. If they're not members of the district, then yes, the district will bill the insurance, but whatever's left over is billed to them. There's fire departments that do an actual special assessment, which is just a flat per parcel fee, for example. Uh, there are other states where your car registration, ours in Ohio is less than $100. My friends in Virginia, for example, they pay almost $1,000 a year. And that then kind of helps cover some of those other fees or current taxes that aren't there. So now again, different people argue what's fair, what's not fair. That's much more of a user-based system, which there's good with that, but it's also a purely individual resident based system versus a lot of other options, which property tax does come a lot of second homes, rentals, Airbnbs, vacant property, commercial type property that you abolish and you shift over, it then actually falls even more on the individual. But that could be one option of ways that we, not to say nickel and dime, but have to just climb up to some type of replacement.
Sure. But just to kind of continue on that path, if we don't get the spending under control, though, on both sides with the reform, and then obviously looking at, where we can, produce the best service for our local areas, but also at the best price, do you think that the fire and EMS service would come into competition with the privates, like a private EMS service or a private fire service? Because as and the reason why, and I know I didn't have this question to you before, but it just popped in my head as we were kind of having this conversation. Is it possible that that might be looked at, or the scare of potential of, because maybe if we don't take hard looks at those types of things, that we've priced ourselves out of business on the public side?
That's a good question. For example, in my community in Ashtabula, probably maybe a third of the fire departments are actually private, completely private. They contract with the local government. Now they contract, so they're essentially public, but they're private.
Mm-hmm.
Under a model where you have no more property taxes. In my case, you'd have no more townships,
Mm-hmm.
which means there's nothing for that fire department to actually contract with. And I don't see there being enough business for there to be a private option. Now, it may be more in your suburban areas where there's more calls, there's more, frankly, fees for service. That's possible, but you still would need some type of public component for some of the money to be raised for the equipment, for example.
Yeah.
So I think that county-based model is probably more of where most, but you would likely run into some suburban areas where, yeah, you might actually see a little bit of that possibly. But yeah, that's a good question. I don't know.
Yeah, I know. And that's just, it's weighed on a lot of things because, that the county system could be very controversial in a lot of places. You don't have that little fire department in your town no more. And you don't know those individuals that are showing up to your house, where before see them locally and you had all these interactions. It's really just a transactional relationship, if you will.
And that's the question I think Ohioans have to ask is, what is having my local fire department worth to me? Local guy, realtor, would complain to me every week as auditor that his taxes were too high, that property taxes were too high. Halfway through my first year, all these different bills, seeing the impact, he got very scared, called me and said, "You can't do these. Our fire department won't be able to survive some of this." And I said, "Well, weren't you the same one that was complaining to me last year about how high your property taxes were?" And he said, "Yes, but the fire department is our community. And if we lose it, I don't know what our community would look like." And so I said, "Well, now you've learned how much your fire department is worth to you." And that's just a gut check that we have to start asking ourselves, what actually are these services worth? For many, I think, in all honesty, they probably wouldn't care what name is on the side of their ambulance. They wouldn't really necessarily care who the people are. They just want the ambulance to come to their house when they call. For others, the whole community aspect may just be so important that they do care and they are willing to pay more for more of a targeted, specialized service.
And if I had to think about that, it'd kind of be like those smaller areas that wouldn't necessarily be able to replace their property tax with a sales or income tax because there's not that base there, are probably the individuals that are more likely to want to pay whatever they need to pay in their property tax to support their local fire departments, in comparison to maybe places of, like you said, and like, well, not like you said, but what maybe I was thinking when you were saying it is, like in the bigger communities, the bigger cities or the metro areas, they might just like, hey, we just want an ambulance to show up when we don't necessarily have that so close connection of community of, small town department, and have that. And that's why I think you gave great advice to the fire chiefs, any local leaders to continue, or if you haven't started, to do those coffee with connections, or to have those little community events to kind of like hopefully get people to show up and realize what that impact is, and because it starts with the relationship for sure. Yeah.
We can't in Ohio take for granted our tax revenue anymore. We have for decades, but it's just gotten to the point where we can't just assume that the property tax money is always coming in.
But everybody sees that pie chart. Everybody sees the pie chart, that pie chart when they get their property tax bill. And majority of it is the school systems in most areas. And in most areas, when we talked about this at the beginning of the episode, that we all voted for that. Our schools asked us for money, and we know that if we want a good community that circles around our school system, it circles around our safety services. That's what it's all about. Do you think that because it does become like there's more levies, and there's a lot of levies now, and if I remember right, I think there was a very few amount of levies that even failed last year, right?
87% of levies passed in November.
Yeah, see?
Across the state. About 6% of school levies passed. 87% of total levies passed across the state. Which there's a weird thing. Now, granted, I tell folks, I totally see most of my residents voting for levies on the exact same ballot they vote to abolish property taxes because they want that service. They know that they got to pay for it somehow, but they also don't really want to pay for it off their property, and they'd rather just abolish the system but still have the service. So total disconnect there. But you're right, the school side, and that's a whole other conversation about school funding. We've been pumping billions and billions more into school funding at the state level with your state taxes. Most folks would say, well, that means then that we shouldn't be paying as much on the property side and local level. I agree. That's not what happened over the last 6 years. Instead, billions more from the state side, billions and billions more from the local property side. Lots of off kilter. Our bills kind of help reshift that, limit it down. Most schools right now do not rely on voters. They actually rely on automatic increases from the 20 mil floor. We're moving that back to essentially a lot more voter control. And, consolidation conversation has to happen there too. 614 school districts.
Wow, that was going to be
student population is down roughly 10% over the last roughly 15 years. Those are tough questions.
Yeah,
and
really
those
tough.
can't be forced by Columbus.
Sure,
but they have to happen.
Is that, we've had a local college, shut their doors up in here. Is that part of an impact of just, where the funding's coming from? Where's the funding come for higher education?
It varies a little bit, but you as a state taxpayer pay roughly $2.9 billion in taxes to actually go to our public higher ed education system. And that's growing, and that's unsustainable. So some community colleges rely on property taxes or local sales tax, for example, on top of state money as well. It varies place by place, but I mean, I'm not popular for saying this, but I don't think a university should have access to your property tax bill. Perfect example of just how that's exploded far beyond. So that has to be looked at as well. We have a governor likely, hopefully, personally, next year, who is promising to eliminate the income tax. That's roughly a $10 billion revenue stream to the state. So if we do that, that's $10 billion that we can't have anymore to spend at the state level. And where's that money going to come from? So those are all conversations that we're going to be dealing with. Now, obviously, you get rid of that $10 billion expense to Ohioans, and the economy, I think, in different pieces kind of really rev up. We've seen that every budget as we decrease the income tax, but those are part of the hard conversations that we have to have.
Sure. And now when you say the income, and that would just to be clear, if Ohio was to eliminate, that would be the state income tax that they would eliminate.
Yep. We're now second lowest in the nation, 2.75% flat income tax. That would just be Ohio eliminating the state income tax. We're one of only handful of states that allow for local income tax, ironically. I don't think his plan, nor would we look to actually eliminate that. That's, again, local decision making by local voters.
Okay. Wow, this has been great, Representative Thomas. I really, truly appreciate this.
There's a lot here.
This has been, there's been so many people that have just want to have a little bit of, information to be, they want to make the best decision for their community and for themselves. And I think that when it comes to the part of where I've talked to a lot of different fire chiefs, like, I'm not really ready to put it on Facebook because it's so controversial as far as information. And I think what you talked about here is exactly how I believe it too. See your local Rotary, be your local chamber speaker, be your community coffee and connections, and create the relationships locally to have the discussions and let them tell 10 people. And I think, and maybe that main message is, what does that look like locally to you as an individual department? So, strongly encourage other area fire chiefs to maybe put together a sheet of what that might look like. What is a sales tax going to be in your community, or an income tax in your community? Or is it even possible to be able to do that, or how that's going to be funded, or that force of consolidation and all those things, not to be scare tactic, but just to be truth. And just, hey, this is what the potential impacts could be. But ultimately, I think we do owe it to them locally to educate in a ways of giving them the information and let them decide if they want to sign or not sign that petition. Because ultimately, I think that there's one ways or another about going about it. Whether if you're really, really pushy, then it kind of becomes alarming to individuals. Like, why are you so pushy? Like, it's almost like this defensive kind of reaction, rather than just being this educator and saying, I'm not trying to, steer you one way or the other. I'm just trying to give you the facts of the matter. And sometimes I think that that's what so much to the point that we talked about earlier. There's just so many places or people that don't truly understand how and what our taxes go for and what they affect in all areas.
I started my career in private development in fundraising, essentially. And, I kind of equated to that. We would never expect just to put out a mailer to get money and just people give money and us never have a relationship with them, never tell them how the money's spent, never have any type of conversation. So I think outside of this whole abolish thing, we just as government have to get back to that model of thinking with our taxpayers.
All right, Josh, one more break, be the last one. So as we bring this episode to a close, take a second and think about the value you just got from this conversation. This is what the Triple P podcast is all about. Real discussions, real leaders, and real impact across the fire service. And if you're listening right now, you're exactly the audience our partners want to connect with. So if you're a company looking to be a part of something that's premier, professional, and proactive, we'd love to have you join the Triple P family. This isn't just advertising, it's alignment. It's alignment with the fire service culture, the decision makers, and with departments that are actively moving the profession forward. Our sponsors aren't just names that we just read off, they're partners we believe in and organizations that we can stand behind. If you want your brand in front of firefighters, officers, and chiefs who are engaged and paying attention, this is your opportunity. So let's finish this episode strong, and maybe next time it's your company that we're talking about. So reach out, tripplepodcast74@gmail.com, and become part of the family today.
And not just view them as mandatory givers of money every, 6 months.
Sure.
On the property side.
Now, we talked a little bit about the economics of, project stalling because of the backed bonds by property tax and the lack of jobs. But would there be and this just popped in my head, so that's why I'm bringing it up. Would there be an opposite effect of like any sort of businesses running to Ohio because of the fact that there is no property tax? As you talked a little bit before, like, because the data center sees, hey, there's no property tax. Like, we all then flood to Ohio because we don't have to pay property tax. Is that a possibility that you could see though, and as well?
That's a strong possibility. There's talk of, corporate owned single family homes and rental properties, for example, have exploded in Ohio. We used to be subsidizing that. Part of our reform efforts were no longer. We're taking that money, $500 million, giving it to homeowners. But I could see a world where those types of businesses, your Blackstones and others, that's one of their big expenses. No longer have that. They can come in, buy up land, buy up properties for much cheaper. Holding costs are much cheaper. Now on the flip side, there's a lot of heavy real property rich type industry that could also view Ohio then as. Now on the flip side of that though, if our sales tax and our income tax is that much higher, depending on what type of products they sell, their products could actually be much more expensive now.
Yeah.
Or their workers they're, higher ups. There's always different costs and benefits, and there will be some, absolutely. The, your population that will benefit from no longer having the property tax, your seniors and others who aren't necessarily paying an income tax, they will have them more money to spend and pump into the economy. Absolutely. But there's always trade-offs, and there's
Yeah.
always pluses and minuses.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, this has been really great. I truly appreciate all your time. I know we've been talking for an hour, so I really can't think of anything else to really cover. If there's anything I've left or left out, I'd like you to cover it. But I'd like you also to kind of like leave. What would you like to leave the audience with, or even local leaders? What would be your takeaway here?
Yeah, no, definitely appreciate it. I think just having the conversations, this is a very emotionally charged topic. One from the taxpayer perspective, because it's their home and it's their livelihood, their investment, and they view it very personally. And obviously from the government side, the tax receiving side, it's their livelihood, it's their mission, it's their vocation. And so you view it very personally. So those emotional aspects have to really be put to the side and just look at purely what are we here for? What's our mission? And I think being open to change, which Ohioans love Ohio to stay Ohio. We love how everything is now, and we are very averse to change, for better and worse.
Mhm.
But I think this has shown us that how we've been operating over the last couple of decades, especially, just simply cannot continue. And those are difficult to think about and to try to forecast out, but it's something we have to do. Um, so I'm really grateful to have the conversation and traveling the state right now. Like I said, last week I was doing 4 of these in-person town halls at different community centers or, invited by different groups. So definitely happy to travel, happy to talk to, whoever, um, just to keep kind of the information going. We did a lot in reform. We have to spread that word of the changes that we made, a lot on our websites, packets of information I can send out to of the different bills and what they mean. That will help taxpayers, and our taxpayers have to know that we've made changes and that we're going to keep improving the system for them.
Yeah, can you give the audience where the website, where they can find you at?
Yeah. So, our official website, if you just Google David Thomas State Representative, that official website comes up. There's press releases. There is some information there. Some of our actual kind of graphics of the bills, for example. Social media wise, I've got some of those graphics as well. Like I said, sharing out a video almost every day of answering questions from residents. That's just David Thomas for Ohio is my Facebook page. Twitter and Instagram, David Thomas OH. Even on TikTok now, kind of crazy.
There you go.
YouTube as well. So search and lots of resources there.
Okay, good. I'll share your website in the notes of our show as well. And if anybody has any questions, I mean, I think that's been the biggest thing is that you taking the time just means a lot. I know that you guys are very, very busy, and for you to take carve out a night to have this discussion really meant a lot to me, and I think it means a lot to the other communities and all the other listeners that are listening. We've covered a lot of ground in a very short period of time, and maybe as we continue to progress on, maybe we can do this again and kind of see where we're at 6 months down the road or a year down the road to see kind of like what has changed and what's the legislator moving on. And I will say just as a local fire chief, I think that it's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure to learn not only from you starting with the legislative conference that you attended for the Ohio Fire Chiefs. I thought that was very informational. I heard a ton of positive feedback about that, and that's why I wanted to kind of give a little bit of a gap. Not everybody can make it to that conference, and wanted to be able to help kind of spread the word of what you guys are really doing. Just a stand-up job on helping educate about this, because truly not only I mean, quite frankly, I mean, we said it at the beginning. I know it affects you locally, and you're representing your people at local, but to your point, it doesn't have really much effect to the state. Like, it's our local property taxes that we voted on that are going to affect us locally. And that's what I think is a huge message, rather than people just being misunderstanding that, well, if we abolish property tax, that the state's going to, feel the pain. And that's just not true. Who's going to feel the pain is us locally.
You are the state.
Thank you for tuning in to the Triple P Podcast, Premier, Professional, and Proactive, brought to you by the Ohio Fire Chiefs Association. If you'd like to hear more, follow us on Spotify, Apple, Google, or wherever you get your podcast. And if you feel so inclined, please help us spread the word by telling your fire and EMS friends about this channel.